Welcome. My name's Dan Chapman. I'm here with Marla Morris, who you'll see in a second. And we are the hosts of this podcast. And we're starting this with the idea of, one, just having interesting conversations with interesting scholars. But, we kind of, at this point, have kind of two strands that we see. One is to talk with scholars about their careers, their influences, their mentors, and so we can kind of create a history of the field. The second is just to have scholars come on and talk about pertinent issues that they're researching, that they're working on, that they're thinking about, and that hopefully we can give a platform to air it for more discussion.
So, yeah, I agree with Dan. Like, our task here is twofold, and for me, it's directly ties into careering, right? So here we are in the present, and we want to look to the past by interviewing scholars in a different generation from us, and have them talk about their influences in their work and their life, and and all of that, and then also to do a kind of a genealogy of the field. And as we know from Foucault, genealogies are completely arbitrary. So there's nothing about this that should be interpreted as reified history or anything like that. And then also the second part is the future. So we also want to talk to younger scholars of different generations, to where we think we're going, what the vision is of curriculum theory, curriculum studies is for the future for younger generations of scholars who are either just starting out or mid-career scholars or scholars of my generation, so that we'll kind of have a circle of scholars and history and genealogy to explore whatever it is that emerges.
Nicely said. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what emerges out of this venture. We already have some good ideas of what to do with it, and we'll see what sticks and what doesn't, and it'll evolve. Today, we're going to talk with Svi Shapiro from UNC Greensboro. Well, he's retired from UNC Greensboro. He's going to talk about his career, and he'll talk about his relationship with David Purpel, who is also a colleague of his at UNC Greensboro. So without further ado, let's cut to the interview. Welcome, Svi. Good to see you. We go back a little bit. 2007 was when I graduated, was when I defended my dissertation at UNC Greensboro, and that's where Svi Shapiro retired from and spent most of his career. So Svi, can you take us back to the early days in your career?
When I came to UNCG, 1979, 1980 was the year that Reagan was elected. And we had 8 years of Reagan, and it was hard to imagine anything worse. It was hard to imagine anything worse than Reagan. He exemplified many of the things that you now see with Trump, but Trump's on steroids. Reagan had a more laid-back approach, but his view of the world and his articulation of it. So that was, coming into UNCG as a junior professor at a time when, it felt very, very difficult to be advocating for any kind of leftist position.
Did you feel threatened then that this program?
Yes. When I came in, there were a number of things that were happening. One was that we had a very tyrannical right-wing dean of the school, who later moved on to become whatever it was, headmaster of a military academy. And he was at full-scale war with Purpel and MacDonald, who had come a few years earlier. I know you did a podcast on MacDonald. They were full-scale war, and I was just a junior professor, never having had a position in the university. So, I was thrown into this kind of very, very, very hostile situation, which was not only personally hostile, but it was a time when we really worried that what we had, our particular grouping, it wasn't a department then, would not even survive, because the dean was really interested in getting rid of people that he considered to be troublemakers, agitators like Purpel, MacDonald, and me to a much lesser extent, since I was, kind of a youngster. And so the whole business of being there was unstable, threatening. And in the end, it led to almost a full-scale war. And finally, he was forced out, but it wasn't an easy process. So I felt, I'm very uncertain about my own future. Plus the fact that when I was introduced, one of the professors introduced me literally saying, "Welcome our young communist to the department." I mean, he actually said that. He actually said that, which is, you can imagine, right? And by the way, it was a time when UNCG was still emerging from a very parochial kind of past. I mean, by the time you got there, it was, a somewhat more worldly place. But it was, having people like Purpel from Harvard and MacDonald from Wisconsin, Madison, bringing these kind of hotshots in was something very new for the university. The much of the faculty there, the teaching faculty, were local people, and it really had a kind of parochial sense to it. Right. So bringing in them and then bringing in me with my kind of strange, tri-national background and, being a Jewish radical and all that was also part of this kind of changing ambience at the university. So that was also part of, it was a difficult time.
That must have cast a pall on the rest of your career, or not a pall, brought awareness to the fact that things could be taken away pretty quickly.
Yes, definitely. I mean, my Jewish background is the kind where I keep my passport and my British passport updated and my suitcase under the bed. I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot to get me, nervous about what's going on. And of course, apropos Trump. So yeah, it was difficult. I didn't know if my future would last. But on the other hand, there was something very, very special about the fact that from the moment that I was interviewed, and I was supposed to be interviewed by James MacDonald, who was already getting sick from, was already on dialysis. And so I was in hospital. David Purpel took over the search process and met me. I remember he came up to New England where I was in Boston, and we met, him and my wife and himself, and we immediately, struck a wonderful relationship. And so in the spite of all of this turmoil going on and the threatening, I knew that I was extremely fortunate to have a colleague like him and MacDonald, who was, out and out radical. And so we knew that there was, I felt fortunate to be, just almost by chance, to be in the situation of having colleagues who not only understood something about who I was, but really fostered and supported where I wanted to go with my teaching and my research. So that was the yin and the yang of this process.
Where were you coming from? Like what?
Well, actually, where I was coming from was that I'd finished my doctorate at Boston University, and it was in foundations essentially. And then I got invited to an interview down in Greensboro. And I tell you the truth, I didn't even know where North Carolina was. When I got off the plane in North Carolina, honestly, this is true, I thought it was going to be desert and cacti. I had no idea where I was,
Wrong side of the country.
Yeah, I had no idea. North Carolina, And then, of course, David Purpel was there and he interviewed me and set it up. And, we hit it off, of course, him being very Jewish in his ethnicity, I put it that way. And I being very conscious of being Jewish in a very non-Jewish area of the country. So we immediately had rapport. And I do remember I went down during Passover, actually, and I was nervous because I only eat matzah during Passover, I don't eat bread. And I was very nervous about confessing when we went out to eat and all that, that I only ate certain foods and all that,
Right.
which he thought was great and amusing, and it was a little bit like the Woody Allen film. The first one was the Annie Hall film, when he goes, that wonderful scene where he goes to her parents' home, and you see him. He sees himself having a long beard, and
right.
I mean that
Everyone
was exactly
yeah.
it was exactly how I felt being being in Greensboro at that time.
Right, and I know that feeling being in Statesboro. And
yeah,
for sure. For all the talk about diversity, they don't think about Judaism too much.
No.
So you got your doctorate at Boston University?
Yes, I got my doctorate in Boston University. I did my undergraduate degree in London, at London University in the end of the 60s in sociology. It was a very influential time, as you can imagine. It was full of, spent more time on the streets and demonstrating than anything else. But it was a great time. And then I lived in Israel for a few years with a group of people who were settling on a kibbutz. And I anticipated I was going to live my life on a kibbutz until I find I didn't like getting up early in the morning to milk cows and pick oranges. So it was at that point, I started thinking about going back to school. I had only had an undergraduate degree, and my wife at that time was an American who lived in Israel, and so we came back. So I applied to graduate school, and I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did a master's in social studies teaching, and did some teaching in the public schools in Philadelphia, which was influential and stressful in my own life, just experiencing what it's like to be in minority neighborhood schools, difficulty of that. And then I applied to the doctoral program at BU at Boston University. And again, I was fortunate. I had a great advisor, a real kind of lefty. And I was able to do what I wanted to do, which was a kind of a sociology of knowledge dissertation that involved the history of the American radicalism in the progressive era, in the early part of the 20th century, looking at what its views were of public education during that progressive era, which was really interesting. Again, and then
looking at Dewey, you're looking at Counts. Who were the people?
Before Counts, actually, because Counts already, I guess we're talking Counts already, late 20s, early 30s, I think. So this was really 1900 to 1912 approximately. And there was just an incredible literature which had never really been written much about, at least at that time. The person who was influential from a distance was Joel Spring, who had done some investigating and wrote a book called, I think it was called Education and the Rise of the Corporate State. And that was really gave me the idea of going back and looking at the literature on on educational radicalism in that period. And there was some remarkable and wonderful stuff written by people whose names now are forgotten.
Right.
And it gave me a lot of fun. I was able to sit in the library in New York, public library in New York, and scroll through this wonderful old radical literature. That was great. I loved it. I felt like a real scholar,
right.
Delving in, sitting in the bowels of New York Public Library, reading all this great stuff. So, and so I was fortunate. I had a good experience at BU, and I knew I wanted to get back in the university and be able to teach. So that's.
So you get to UNCG and met David Purpel.
Yeah.
He's a big influence on you or mentor to you. Like how?
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to overstate over the years how important he was to me. Even to this day, I mean, honestly, there's hardly days where it go by where if I watch a movie or I see Larry David or something where I don't laugh about the conversations we had. I mean, he was a huge influence on me in many, many ways. So, I mean, could take up most of the interview. I mean, he was so much more than a traditional academic, if I can put it that way. I mean, he was a human being first. He had profound humanity first. He had profound wit. He was very humorous. He was a great storyteller. And I think he really expanded, expanded my thinking and pedagogy in many ways. I mean, one of them, I can name several, but the first way, of course, I think of is that his teaching was so predicated on questions, on asking really interesting, provocative questions that had no definitive answer. And he gloried in the sense that there were questions to be asked for which there were no, definitive answers. I mean, he was a post-positivist, before post-positivism. I mean, he gloried in the idea that questions led to multiple answers. Mm-hmm. He gloried in that. And that was something, I came out of a fairly traditional sociology program. We were still rooted in the kind of positivist search for what's true and what's not true and what is correct. So, I mean, expanded my sense that when you go into the classroom, asking the right questions was really, really key. One of the questions that always stuck with me was in his interviewing of doctoral students. I don't know whether you experienced this, but when we did interview doctoral students, his first question often would be something like, tell me what you're interested in. That is the individual. What do you want to know? What are you interested in pursuing? And rather than saying, this is the program and this is what you got to do, he started with the idea that the person coming in ought to have their own questions. If they didn't have questions, then probably this wasn't the place for them. He wanted to say, here's a space for you to pursue questions that have great import to you existentially.
Well, this is very funny that you bring this up, because that was the exact question you asked me when I came into your office.
That's great. That's great. Program. That's wonderful. Yeah, there you are. There's the answer to your question.
Came back full circle. And it was one of the reasons I went to UNC Greensboro instead of Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
Because in Chapel Hill, it would be like, okay, this is what you want to do. Well, let's see if that fits in our program.
Right.
And with you, it was like, oh, well, that's interesting. Here's you can read this, you can read that, and not really worried about whether there's someone else there doing the exact same thing that I'm.
Right. Well, that's a great response. That tells you a lot. I mean, obviously, the very fact that that had rubbed off on me in terms of how to see education, obviously how to see a doctoral program, but even how to see the life of students. That the life of students, and I use the word life, emphatically, that it was about the life of students, and that was something that came through very clearly in the way he interacted with students, in the way that he taught the classes, that the life of the student, and not just their intellectual life, but their life as full human beings, had to be not only honored, but nurtured. Mm-hmm. And that was really something that was very influential. I mean, I can think of a number of questions that he asked. One of them used to make me laugh when he used to teach, particularly the undergraduates. He said, well, you got to know this, you got to do that, you got to know algebra. And he'd say, but what happens if you don't like it? And he'd say, well, how many times should we tell somebody they don't like spinach, they need to eat it? I mean, is there a point when you say, I don't like spinach, and you don't have to eat it anymore? In other words, he was in that kind of tradition of saying that students should be free to be creative, to pursue their own meanings, to pursue their own intellectual passions. Of course, he understood, and you understand, we all understand, that part of what schools do is actually get rid of that. I mean, they just simply, they eliminate that pursuit, that passion. There is no place for it because it's all about, getting through the curriculum and so on.
To kind of shift the conversation here a little bit, I'm curious as to, because I'm hearing this from a different, I went to LSU and studied with Bill Pinar, and so I'm coming from a different angle, right? So I was curious as to your relationship with Jim McDonald and curriculum studies versus social foundations, what you think. And I know those two fields are different, but there's a lot of overlap. And
Yeah.
that's always something that I've been curious about, because I never really understood what the difference was.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I did some thinking about that in preparation for this. Well, one of the things that happened, I think, was that, where do I start on this? I would say that the sociology of education, which I came out of, was very much in that black box mode, inputs and outputs, if that makes sense. You know, what's the social class of students going into it? How many are successful, and so on. So there was no space really at that time in that kind of sociology, in that kind of sociological thinking, for looking seriously in a social cultural way at what actually happens pedagogically and curriculum wise. So I would say that two things began to happen, I think, in the early days, when I go back to the period that I came into UNCG, that caused a kind of convergence of foundations, what we used to think of as social foundations, with curriculum studies. In other words, that really broke down the artificial barrier between curriculum studies, pedagogical studies, and social foundations. There were a number of influences. One that, by the way, that came from England was what was called the new sociology of education. I don't know whether people even pick up on that now. People like Michael Young and Basil Bernstein and so on. Mm. Their work really challenged, I think, the black box idea of sociology of education, and put at its forefront that what we need to look at is what actually happens in classrooms, what people learn, how we put together the curriculum, where does it come from historically, culturally, how is the curriculum shaped by cultural, social, ideological forces. So that was a major shift in thinking about what the sociology of education was. It was no longer inputs and outputs. It was about what actually happened, what people actually learned, how they learned, and who decided what was to be learned. Then you had other influences coming in. About 1970, of course, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire came out, and that too, of course, was a whole new influence, because it put front and center the connection between, again, what education is about, what we learn, and the way it was formed and shaped by cultural, ideological forces, political forces. So those are two areas. Then you add to that the people like MacDonald, who were doing curriculum theorizing. Now, the book that I was first introduced to when I first came to UNCG was a collection that MacDonald was involved in called The Curriculum Reconceptualists. I don't know if it's still in circulation, but that was a path-breaking collection of pieces, of articles that again really sought to position curriculum, what we learn and how we learn, within a kind of cultural, ideological, political formation. So you had all of these things coming together, which really shook up what I think of as the more traditional idea of social foundations of education. So for me, what happened is I very quickly saw or felt that social foundations of education, of course, was concerned with curriculum issues. I mean, in my opinion, how could it not be? Because what we teach in schools, I mean, I'm talking to the converted here, what we teach in schools, what the curriculum is really, of course, the sedimentation of ideology, culture, politics, you know, what the subject matter is, how we teach it, all of that is shaped fundamentally by social and cultural forces.
So, do you have any connection to Philip Wexler? Do you know his work?
To
Philip Wexler.
Yeah, I do know his work. I mean, he was I can't cite, but he was definitely one of the figures, one of the people that was profoundly involved, along with people like MacDonald, Michael Apple, who, by the way, you know, was another, a whole series of influential people. But yes, I mean, all of that really, for me, made it a no-brainer, if I can put it that way, that social foundations was embraced studies of curriculum, studies of pedagogy. All of that became, as well as the more traditional concerns with who succeeds in school, who fails. And those are the traditional bread and butter issues of sociology of education. Still very important, of course. But really what happens in the classroom, what we teach, is part and parcel, in my opinion, of foundations. If that answers the question.
So it was coming from both fields, right? It was coming from foundations that were breaking down barriers between what is sociology of education.
Yeah.
And it was coming from the curriculum that had the reconceptualization.
That's right. That's right. And when I read people like MacDonald, and I read curriculum theorists like Pinar and so on, it was clear that there was, this separation of curriculum, pedagogy, and social foundations was part of a kind of positivist mindset. It was part of the way we fragmented how we think about education. And, from a kind of social perspective that I have, that this was an artificial this was a kind of reification of areas that in fact should not be separated. They really it all belongs to the larger picture of what it is to be engaged in foundations work. I mean,
so I know,
yeah.
I know it, maybe it was the 70s or before that, with social foundations, traditional social foundations departments, that like if you did sociology of education, you'd have to have a PhD in sociology, or PhD. Do they still do that?
That's a great question. Actually, my own history is that when I decided to go and do my doctorate, I applied to a number of different places. Some were doing some in the educational departments, some in sociology. I remember that I applied to Harvard School of Education looking at what they called social policy. And it was precisely at that time what I have been criticizing, that it was, first of all, of course, very statistical. It wasn't at all phenomenological. It wasn't at all to do with experience. And it separated out the kind of the curriculum issues, the kind of, ideological issues from the study of schools. So in the end, partly because I didn't get accepted there, and partly because I had, the divine intervention led me to a program at Boston University with a faculty that was very broad and didn't teach these separations. So it was by good chance. But I would say, does it still exist? My guess is, and I don't keep up with this, that if you go study sociology, if you go to study to a sociology department, everything I know, they have become, in their pursuit of becoming academically, validated, they continue to be ever more statistical, positivistic in how they view things. And, I don't want to say this, that this represents the totality of what goes on. But I still think sociology is still very much, wedded to that kind of positivist view, and doesn't really situate itself in the kind of curriculum issues and pedagogical issues that interest me and I presume interest you.
So new hires aren't necessarily coming from sociology departments, but they're coming from foundations of education.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I don't want to, again, I don't keep up with this in terms of who's who, but yeah, I think for one thing, there's a status issue. People who go to sociology and get their PhDs in sociology, in the arts and sciences, feel they're kind of stepping down when they go to work in a school of education. Right. I imagine that still hasn't changed a whole lot, so, yeah.
Well, we find that everyone outside of the college of education thinks that we're too practical.
Yeah.
Everyone within the college of education thinks that we're too theoretical.
Right. That's right. Exactly. And that, that speaks, I think, to I think the problematics of social foundations, because as you know, the sociology, the social foundations, whatever they were called at various times, always raised the kind of broader social, political, ideological issues that for people who were saying, well, we got to teach teachers, what are they going to do next week? Or, how do you get students up to be able to do well on the test? This seems to be really, too distant from anything that's helpful to students in the everyday world of teaching in schools. And in some senses, they're right about that.
Right.
To go back to Purpel, just for a moment here, he didn't hold, although he of course worked with schools all of his career, he was not a great believer that the social revolution would come through schools, not at all. And he was very critical of the teaching profession in general, for being too passive, to being too acquiescent to the kind of political managers of things.
And that was back in the 80s when unions were stronger and
but even the unions, as you know, for a large extent, the unions were still, and the teachers who made them up were still wedded to a pretty conventional set of curriculum and pedagogic aspirations. Sure, getting more money for kids, more resources and so on, important. And Purpel himself would never decry making life a little better for teachers and for students. He never was at all at odds with the idea that whatever you can do to make the world a little kinder, a little more humane, was worth supporting. But basically, let's be under no misapprehension that was going to be a revolution. So there was a kind of, I would say, some disillusionment. I think when he first came, I think came out of an idea that somehow schools could be at the center of social change. But I think he really came to be very, came to lose faith in the idea that schools would ever fulfill that role.
What were Purpel's major contributions to the field in terms of just the ideas? Like, who was he situated with?
Yeah, he wrote a book, his first book, which was quite well used, on supervision. Fairly traditional, but even then, of course, his view of it was, certainly wasn't radical, but it was certainly more collaborative. And this goes back a long time, And I think when he came to UNCG, he came initially to be director of teacher education. That was his original role. That was his role at Harvard until they closed the program at Harvard. That's when he started looking for a new job. I think when he came to UNCG, his work with McDonald was really, I think, eye-opening to him. I think it really began a process of transformation that was growing. The seeds of it were already there, but they were growing. And that is that he saw himself really increasingly at odds with traditional kind of teacher preparation and educational preparation, educational administration, all of that. He began to develop essentially a kind of morally transformative view of what education ought to be about. If you don't mind, I can read you a little bit. I would like to read from him. Is that all right with you?
Yeah.
This is from a book that he and I did. And he wrote in the book, there's what he calls his credo, I should say. And I'll read a piece of it, if you don't mind, because I think it really illustrates part of where he's at. And he said this was number 5 of a number of categories that he outlines. He says, we affirm the central importance of nourishing a consciousness of moral outrage and social responsibility. As educators, we must go far beyond informing, describing, and analyzing, and must free ourselves from the destructive force of moral numbness. We must help our students to become aware of our failures to meet our moral and cultural imperatives, and to help them inform their intellectual understanding with moral judgments. An education that engenders a posture of promiscuous tolerance, scholarly detachment, or cynical weariness towards unnecessary human suffering is an abomination. We must avoid the temptation to teach only what makes one feel good, or to teach that social problems are only, quote, interesting. Education is not about finding out things, but about finding ourselves. It is not enough to say further research is needed, when what is needed is not more information, but more justice. To know without a sense of outrage, compassion, or concern deadens our souls and significantly eases the struggle of demonic forces to capture our consciousness. We need an education that produces moral indignation and energy rather than one that excuses, mitigates, and temporizes human misery. Abraham Heschel reminds us that although only a few are guilty, all are responsible. Our task as educators is therefore to teach students to identify the guilty, to have compassion for the victims, and to exercise their responsibility to reduce, if not eliminate, injustices. Now, there's a way in which, so much of his thought, I think, is captured in that one statement that he has. Very powerful, eloquent. Stanley Aronowitz, the great critical theorist, called David his rabbi. And I think that was apt. David was not a great critical theorist in the traditional sense of being, a great analyst, critical race theory, critical class. That wasn't really his forte, although he was certainly a fellow traveler with critical pedagogy and critical theory, and was informed by it and was totally supportive of what we call a movement, the kind of left academy of critical thought. But that really wasn't the wellsprings of him. The wellsprings of him were really finally found a kind of a flowering when he read the book by Abraham Heschel called The Prophets. That happened quite a lot later, and the time that I was there, when he had a year off, or 6 months off, or a semester off, and he went and did some study at a religious retreat center in Boston. And that's where I think he found what he was searching for, which was this idea of that the first and foremost of educational work, of academic work, was not critical analysis, but it was to stir and nurture moral outrage. He felt, like the prophets, that yes, of course, we must highlight the dissonance between what we might say in our ideals and how we actually live in a society. Surely we have to highlight that, show the dissonance, show the contradictions.
Right.
But before those contradictions, one has to be aware and affirm, that was a word he liked, to affirm what are the moral wellsprings of our work. What is it that we really affirm morally? He was saying without the moral outrage, all the rest doesn't matter. In other words, he would say critical intellectual work is necessary, but not sufficient. Critical intellectual work is necessary, but not sufficient, because what is needed at the base of that is this kind of moral indignation and outrage. And he saw it, I think his strength, what he spoke to, was articulating in very powerful ways, and I think that illustrates it, this kind of outrage at what he saw as the immoral basis of the way we lived. That was the wellspring, and that's what he saw as having to be nurtured.
That must be very challenging.
Go ahead. Oh, that's fine.
This must have been very challenging to the academy because it's beneath intellectual thought. It's pre-thought.
Exactly right. And I would say that part of outside of the kind of left academy, if I can call it that, of course, there was no resonance for what he was. It wasn't people, people were on a different planet, okay? They're on a different planet a lot of the time. So, but even within the left academy, even within the critical theorist kind of, regions, I think generally speaking, David was held in high regard. His passion, his commitment to social justice was unequivocal and powerful. But at the same time, he was using categories, what we might call religious categories or spiritual categories, that really were not at the forefront, or even he saw it as really marginalized or even ridiculed by, I mean, let's face it, the academics, whether, of all stripes really, are rooted in the Enlightenment traditions of rationality and reason and analysis. The notion of articulating the worldview in terms of moral commitments that themselves were based on what we might call the search for ultimate meaning was something really, outside of the traditional academic kind of jargon, academic experience, and so on.
Yeah, were there other people articulating that at the time? Because I think
I think there are not many. I mean, yeah, but not really within education. I mean, he found his support in people, in not only in the kind of Jewish thought of people like Heschel, but also in other people's work, like Dorothy Zolli, feminist theologians, Beverly Harrison, Walter Brueggemann, whose work is extraordinarily powerful. Even Cornel West, people who were unafraid to link their critical analysis with moral and religious categories. I think it's interesting that part of David's evolution was the fact that he came to the South and was met by large numbers of students who came out of religious backgrounds. And in our case, in our program, of course, as you know, and going back to the course that we had on Genesis, most of these students were recovering from religion in the traditional sense, recovering Baptists, recovering Catholics, recovering Jews, who were recovering from church-like religion, but were very, very deeply kind of concerned with spiritual questions, what Paul Tillich called, questions of ultimate meaning. Right. And I think that's really where David's own imagination and his own sense of stepping out of the kind of usual academic thinking and talking was really kind of nurtured, to step out of that, to embrace a very different discourse.
Mm.
So, from the curriculum studies perspective, this reminds me of the work of Dwayne Huebner.
Yeah. Huebner also was another one of that coterie, I can call it, that gang of curriculum theorists. Absolutely. There was, I don't keep up with the curriculum field today, but certainly in that period, there was a flowering of really interesting, thoughtful people who were stepping out of the traditional categories. So yeah, I mean, those people certainly spoke to David. I think, David sometimes got frustrated that even there wasn't enough, there wasn't a kind of a clear, passionate articulation. I think he was drawn to the language of the prophets, the Abrahamic people who were unafraid to stand up and, and shout from the hilltops, their indignation, their moral outrage at what was going on. Yeah, I mean, he was, I would say, just so outraged at the way, for example, school life was dictated by hierarchical thinking in every regard. I mean, by the grades, by the smiley faces, by the stratification systems, by the fact that there was a constant search for ways of distinguishing and stratifying people. He was outraged by the idea of that schools and the culture should define a human dignity and worth by achievement values. He was outraged by that idea, that human worth, human dignity should be something, as he saw it, it should be something that's unconditional and should not be conditioned on how well somebody works or does schoolwork or whatever. He was outraged by that. It wasn't just that it was an intellectual disagreement. It stirred his fiber, really, that kind of thinking.
Well, Marla may be interested in the course we had because she studied religion in Louisiana, in New Orleans, right?
Yeah, I have a master's degree in religious studies from Loyola.
Yeah.
And I'm Jewish, so I was the only Jewish person in the program, which was interesting. But what
Yeah.
I learned from that program was I took a seminar on Martin Luther from a very well-known Luther scholar, Dennis Jans. And I learned where anti-Semitism came from right out of Luther. And
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, great. So from that class, when I went into my doctoral program, all that
Yeah.
stuff about Luther went into my dissertation about the Holocaust. I'm like, well, yeah, I can see the roots in Protestantism.
Yeah.
And of course, for much further back than that. But I was shocked when I read Luther. I mean, it was just, it was
Yeah.
like, oh my God, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and yeah, so, yeah, I did my dissertation on the Holocaust. I wrote a book called Jewish Intellectuals in the University.
Yeah.
And then I became a chaplain at our local Trauma One hospital. So, you know, that all of these issues in spirituality have been very important to me and still marginalized. It's very hard to get published, you know, if you don't, you know, you don't have the right language right now. What still, this kind of things that you're talking about are kind of the same problems.
Right. Right. And to go back, yeah, I mean, in David's case, he was not religious in the traditional sense. He didn't go to synagogue.
No, I'm
The
just
only
saying.
time I ever saw him in synagogue was when
Yeah.
I had my daughter's bat mitzvah and he came.
Right.
But he was deeply Jewish. I mean,
Right.
one of his grandparents was literally cut down by the Cossacks. You know, his parents were immigrants. He grew up in a kind of Bundist environment. You know, Jewish, strongly Jewish, socialist, secular environment.
Yeah.
So he didn't grow up at all with any kind of a disposition towards any kind of religious thinking. So this was a kind of evolution in his own, the gravitation towards religious ideas, religious thought came later. It became a way of articulating things that he kind of felt in his soul. Now, I think there's another dimension to all of this, which was also that he was always intrigued by what we might call the mysterious. You know, if you go back to the class that you took on Genesis,
Yeah.
Dan, one of the things that he reveled in was the fact that we had people brought their own Bibles. We read the Genesis stories, and we found that people, of course, the Bibles people were using and grew up with were huge differences in just simply in the language and the way things were presented. Now, for him, there wasn't a search for the real truth of these things. It was really a sense that truth itself was a forever receding horizon. That even though our job, in a sense, was to try to call out lies, to call out distortions, it wasn't that we put in place the correct view of things. He believed there was a kind of if I can put it this way, a kind of mysteriousness to the universe, if I can put it that way. That, you know, our job was to get closer to the truth, but we never got to the truth.
Mm.
I always remember one particular student, a Catholic nun, who came and studied with us, and what we might call a leftist nun. And she wrote a profound dissertation on what she called the endarkenment, not the enlightenment.
Oh, nice.
It was a wonderful dissertation. I still remember it to this day, you know, and it was basically an attempt to recapture the idea that it was not possible to know everything. And we should, in a sense, revel in the idea that there was a kind of mysteriousness to the universe. You know, I remember he used to tell this story, you probably heard it, the Hindu notion of the origins of the world. You know, the world rests on turtles.
Mm-hmm.
What do the turtles rest on? More turtles. You know, and he would say, and it's turtles all the way down.
Right.
You know, I used to love that story, which was that, you know, we don't know everything, and we're never going to know anything. And in a sense, we should glory in the mysteriousness of the universe. Not that we should simply say, oh, right, you know, throw up our hands. We should constantly search for ways of getting closer to that truth. But truth was ultimately elusive. There was a kind of mystery to the truth. And that, of course, was completely antithetical to a positivist mindset. I mean, it didn't even begin to gel with that idea.
Well, I remember this course that we took on Genesis. and we met in his house, right? And we
Yeah.
sat around the table and we ate. Someone would bring bread and
Right. Yeah.
and we break bread together, and
Yeah.
it was really a great course.
Yeah.
But we had to. I mean, what do I want to say? I think my expectation was to sort of have everyone's different reading, and
Yeah.
isn't that interesting, and maybe get between the
Yeah.
lines of what the text was. But we constantly had to stop because people were traumatized by what they learned.
It's true. It's true. I'd forgotten
There were
that.
so many tears in this course
Yes.
about. Do you remember that? Everyone, every week,
You're
someone,
reminding me of it. I'd forgotten that. There
yeah,
were people who were shocked, weren't they? They were
right.
just shocked by this.
Yes, they were shocked, and they
Yeah.
angry at their
Yeah.
parents and their preachers and what
Yeah.
they believed all of this time, and
Right.
and it was I wasn't that patient with it, I have to say.
No, no, I know. But it was I mean, profoundly unsettling for people
Yeah.
to see truth, if I can put it that way, in that light, to see that, truth was a multiplicity of truths and so on,
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, I think that was the kind of that was part of his, what he would call his, I don't know, I can't remember the language now, but it was certainly a kind of, he certainly embraced a kind of, the notion that the universe is a kind of is mysterious. And, by the way, one of my childhood interests, which has now returned in my retirement, is to go back to my interest in astronomy. And one of the things, and quantum physics, I was very interested in those things as a kid, well, physics anyway, now quantum physics. And one of the things that comes at me forcibly now as I look at some of this stuff and I read and I watch a lot of these wonderful videos that now exist is what we're being told about the universe, about the universe, about the 100 million stars or whatever it is, galaxies that exist in the universe, and that it all came from one speck, in time. And the universe is 14 billion years old. And, endless on and on and on about what we come away with is just the profound mystery of all of this. I mean, what I would say is whether it's looking at, the quantum nature of the atom, or whether it's looking at the macro universe, what I come away with is that there's so much more here that is just beyond any kind of easy human grasp of what we're dealing with. This is another, for me, another way into this idea, not that, that we shouldn't continue to try to understand and figure out what black holes are, and, how the universe came to be, and is there an end to the universe, and are there multiple universes, and all of these questions. But it's mind-boggling, and it leads me to that notion in a different way of kind of embracing this idea that human understanding really has to grapple with mystery.
Mm.
And he was unafraid to grapple with it. He was unafraid really to simply find a kind of joy in the fact that human understanding was limited, and that human capacity for understanding things was multiple. That there wasn't a simple truth out there and whatever, and that he embraced that. He embraced the kind of multiplicity and the endlessness, the endless journey of trying to understand things.
I wonder if you could talk. I don't want to cut you off, but
No, it's okay.
About your contributions to the field, your career, your intellectual career, and his influence on that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we wrote and put together a whole slew of books together. We wrote together. We taught together. So my own kind of view of things evolved, and I began to embrace many of the things that I've been talking about, which is that we have to make a distinction between education and schooling. That education and schooling are not synonymous. That education really has to be connected to the search for a different kind of world. It has to embrace the idea of the kind of moral basis and spiritual basis for our quest. You know, I was schooled in kind of Marxist sociology when I was going through all my training, and that's never left me. I mean, I was always was and still am embrace the idea of issues of power, the issues of inequality, the issues of you know the material basis of you know of people's of our thinking of ideology and so on. So I've always sought to kind of wed together my own leanings towards those kind of Marxist sociological ideas, but the need to expand it. I found, for example, in the work of people like Walter Benjamin, people that I embraced because they were both fierce critics of inequality, of social injustice, while at the same time embracing a kind of worldview that was moral and spiritual. I would say that the religious part of me is the part that tries to hold on to having faith in these very dark times, especially now. You know, the dark times of seeing the worst of human inclinations and behavior, politics. You know, it's the sense that, you know, Martin Luther King's famous statement that, you know, history is long, but it bends towards justice. You know, it's that sense of faith that I have that I think comes from my own Jewish kind of background, which is that we've been engaged in this struggle for justice for a very long time. You know, the Egyptians are still with us. The struggle against slavery is still there. You know, I'm still at heart a socialist. You know, profoundly disillusioned with the direction in which you know, part of my upbringing was very Zionistic, and because where I am now is very disillusioned and horrified by the direction in which the state of Israel has taken. You know, I have a lot of strands to my thought. The sociology, the Marxism, the sense of faith in history, and in the notion that there is some direction in which we move, possibilities, and certainly the need to articulate fearlessly a kind of moral outrage, and the need to really grapple with those questions of ultimate meanings, which is really questions about what does it mean to be a human being. In fact, the questions that the two questions that MacDonald placed at the center of his work, which were, what does it mean to be human, and how do we live together? I always remember those questions because they're absolutely fundamental. What does it mean to be human? How do we live together? You know, and I add to that question now, how do we live with the nature? And how do we live with the natural environment? Because that has to be added, I think, as the third question. So those are the questions, I think, that, you know, what does it mean to be human? That's a question that, what do we teach, really rests in the end. What is the curriculum going to be? I think rests on those two questions. What does it mean to be a human being? And how do we live together? And out of those questions, I think we could generate what's worth teaching, what's worth learning, what should our kids learn in schools and elsewhere out of those questions.
So Dan, how do you see your work then influenced by Svi?
Well, I mean, I think that he's challenged me in a lot of ways. One is the way of embracing my Judaism and what that means to the critical tradition, because we see it time and time again. We've mentioned many Jewish names in this conversation, and what place my background in the Jewish upbringing has in forming critical thought, or informing my critical thought. And that's, you know, something that I've wrestled with in my career, and that's something that he certainly has challenged me about. I know his book "Strangers in the Land" was addressing that, and also this idea of of moral outrage, expressing moral outrage without restraint. Because I find sometimes if I do that, that I push people away. I know Svi has a very nice way, I think, of both being open and being freely himself, his political self, in the classroom. And sometimes I find when I'm freely my political self, I shut down a lot of
Yeah.
voices. So that's something that I've struggled with or thought about, and that's that's a challenge to my growth as an educator throughout the years that
Yeah.
he brought to the fore.
I absolutely resonate with that conundrum. And, I think it would resonate, with David's work, which is how does one both articulate moral outrage without being a scold, without, pointing your finger, becoming, it's not easy to do that, I think. It's not easy to do. I think David's trick was, and sometimes he exceeded it too, but I think his trick was to always be asking the questions,
Right.
pushing against the questions, really, rather than simply standing on a soapbox, And the other part of that is that I would say that is always, I try to always do this, is to say, always tell the students, whatever I tell you, whatever you read might be entirely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I remember saying this always to the undergraduates. I say to them, that big book we used to use for the reader, 381, I say to them, remember, every single article in this wonderful collection, everything could be wrong. I say, all I can do is tell you the way I understand things, the way I see it. That's all I can do. I can't stand outside the world. I can't stand in an absolute relationship to the truth. I can only tell you as I see it to the best of my ability. By the way, and I would say, that's what science does, essentially. Science is not just a bunch of, opinions pulled out of the air, like Trump talking about trees, all of that nonsense he says, right? It's all going to go away or whatever. I mean, science is not like that. Science is a series of conjectures. Always be wrong, right? I mean, global warming could be completely wrong, but on the basis of everything we know and all of the work that people are doing, this seems to offer the best explanation.
Mm.
I remember asking, comparing creationist theory with evolution. And I'd say, evolutionary theory is a theory, and it's gone through changes itself. It might be completely wrong, but you know what? It's a whole lot better than any other theory we have at explaining, the development of life and development of the earth.
Right.
Donna Haraway on a YouTube about her work on what she calls fabulation talks about creationist theory, and she says that people who teach that should go to jail.
Yeah, well, that's not. Yeah, I mean, that's another way of approaching it. Yeah.
She just is in your face, like, yeah, right. That's good. I like that.
But the other side, I would also say, is that David's embrace of the prophets was that the prophets were, he would say, they were not liked in their own time any more than people like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela. I mean, people didn't embrace these people and say how wonderful they are at the time when they were articulating what was going on in the world. And he said, the prophetic voice is always going to be a voice that is people are going to, find uncomfortable. What was it? Walter Brueggemann's notion of the goal of religion is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. It's a brilliant formulation that people are not going to welcome necessarily the voices that tell them that we're living in a screwed up world that's, doing great harm to humanity and to nature. So that also comes with the territory. I mean, I think I would say the prophetic voice is one where you have to accept that, you're not going to be welcomed in every sphere. I think that goes with the territory, really. And I think that, he accepted the fact that, that people could be enraged by the things that he had to say. Good. By the way, one other question that David asked, I don't know if you remember this in your classes, that I always liked very much. And that was on the earliest, I think in his first classes, he would say to people to write down the 10 things that are, the 10 greatest problems that we face in the world. And people would write down, disease and poverty and war, da, 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 da. And then he'd say to them, the second question I have is, what do schools teach that addresses these questions? And whoa, and then that simple, asking a simple question, and most people in the class would say nothing.
Right.
They had nothing to do with these teaching about these problems. He'd say, well, there's something to think about, isn't it?
Right. So, I think we've had a good conversation.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about where you think the field should go, or we can skip that, or?
I really, I'm hesitant to do that because I'm out of it, so to speak. This is a re-entry for me into something that occupied most of my life. So I'm not really, I think that there are things that when I left the academy, not that long ago, 3 years ago, that were worrying to me, I felt, and maybe these are unfair criticisms, but I'll throw them out in a way. I felt that there was, in our program, in the program in UNCG, a greater attempt to make the program so embrace a kind of academic acceptability that the emphasis in the student's experience moved away from the pursuit of meaning, from a kind of an embrace of their humanity, towards a very rigid, stultifying, albeit radical, but nonetheless, very kind of orthodox embrace of what academia is about, publications and all of that. I always say to people that when it comes to dissertations, imagine nobody's ever going to read your dissertation, which is probably the case. But what it does matter is whether the dissertation you write was a meaningful one to you, whether it was an opportunity for you to explore and affirm something important. But as far as what I saw as I became towards the end of my career was that seemed to have disappeared, and what became more and more the obsession was the kind of rigor of academic orthodoxy. It wasn't the message, it wasn't the content so much as the kind of medium in which it was embraced. And I felt that maybe this is a cheap shot. I don't want to be too harsh here, but I will say, I found that many of those who came out of women's studies programs and were teaching from a women's studies point of view were very, and for understandable reasons, were so concerned about making what they were doing acceptable in the academic world, that the original intent of women's studies as a kind of activist, transgressive activity was being lost to a kind of academic orthodoxy.
Well, that's because when women were going up for tenure, they'd have men in their departments, and then they would say, this women's work, well, that's not scholarship. And so they felt like they had to prove that this is worthwhile and legitimate scholarship. So maybe that's why it went in that direction, which is unfortunate, but that's what women had to do to get tenure.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
Completely agree with what you're saying. And I'm just saying I think it's unfortunate, but I certainly see that as part of the trade-off that has been made. And I'd say the second thing is that one of the dangers of the kind of postmodern era, I think, one of the dangers of it, albeit what we talked about in this discussion about multiple views and so on, is a danger that it becomes impossible to really articulate a kind of moral critique or even an intellectual critique, because there's always the thought that, what makes my view any better than yours? And you see this, I think you see this being battled out, for example, around the issue of human rights, where, of course, there are those who would say, well, human rights is nothing but a Western construction. And as such, it has no more validity than any other indigenous form of knowing. So you reach the kind of what I think is the harmful kind of notions that genital mutilation on women is simply one more, cultural practice, which has as much legitimacy as denying that. I think I think is very deeply problematic. I think it's reached its crescendo and it's most dangerous when you have a kind of Trump-like character who says all of this is a hoax, all of it is lies. That's I always remember reading one of the English theorists in one of the books, I've forgotten his name, who says, well, everything is not true. Auschwitz was just made up. The Holocaust was just another story. I mean, he said that, of course, ironically, in being critical of the dangers of the postmodern mood, where nothing is real. Everything becomes just another story. That is juggling. You talk about juggling things. I mean, on one hand, you want to affirm that there are multiple views and so on. That truth is historically rooted. On the other hand, we have to be very, very nervous about undermining any claims about what is right, what is truthful, or so on. That is, I think, part of what the difficulty, I think one of the dangers and difficulties of the kind of intellectual era in which we live and political era in which we live.
That's what people talk about when they talk about post-truth.
Yeah.
And you see, it's been interesting in the Trump era to see professors who were lecturing on there is no objective truth, then flipping the switch now in the Trump era and saying, no, there is objective truth.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I always remember Patrick Moynihan, the New York senator, when he said, he famously said, you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your facts.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and of course, we on the postmodern side always excoriated facts, facts were just ideologically rooted. So, I mean, so this is a conundrum. I don't claim a simple way of approaching this. I mean, we've got to assert that truth and knowledge and so on is historically rooted, but we have to be very careful to end up where Trump ends up, saying everything is just a bunch of lies. It's all made up by the media or whatever it is, by leftist academics.
If the only truth is the assertion of power, then we're in real danger.
Exactly right. So it's a conundrum. It's a difficulty. I mean, it's not something that I personally think could easily be resolved.
Yes. So Marla, do you want to end with anything?
Oh, no, I think it's been fantastic. I learned a lot from you and Svi and the connections between both of you. And I'm just thinking in the back of my mind what kind of a background I came from, at LSU, and how different my program was from your program, and I'm really interested in genealogy in the Foucauldian sense. And I'm finding all of this very interesting because this is a whole different way of talking about education than the way that I was educated. So I'm learning a lot about you and Dan and on the other faculty members in our department who went to the same institution. And now I better understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Because it is a different tradition. I really think social foundations is a different tradition than curriculum studies. When I hear you talk, I'm thinking about, the other side of that tree, right? And I'm not going to get into, but this is what makes all of this very interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all come out of different historical traditions.
Yes, I absolutely. That makes sense to me. Completely what you're saying. Anyway, this has been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Svi. We appreciate it.
Thank you for asking. Actually, it's been really a trip down memory lane. Very interesting to me.